All praise belongs to Allah and peace and blessings be upon His Messenger. In the last episode, we already spoke about the definition of the Quran. And we defined what the Quran is. And now we are ready to take up upon our investigation to find out where it originated from. So first we have to go to the 6th century, because there a man came forward called Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, who brought the Quran with him. The Quran, like he was the source where the Quran appeared, like through him. We're not talking about like where it originated from, if it was from himself or from Allah or from another teacher. We're not talking about this, but just the attribution to this book, to the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, is something that is clear. Like no one really attacks or makes a claim against it or attacks this position. And then when we take this book and we open it and we see what does it say about its origin, we stumble upon the following verses. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم إنه لقول رسول كريم ذي قوة عند ذي العرش مكين مطاع ثم أمين. So the Quran says about itself that indeed this Quran is the word of Allah delivered by Jibril alayhi salam, the noble messenger angel, full of power, held in honor by the Lord of the throne, obeyed there in heaven and trustworthy. So basically the claim that the Quran is making about itself, after we found its attribution to Muhammad ﷺ, is that these are words of Allah brought down by an angel to this man in the 6th century. And then when we investigate the Quran further, we see that it negates every claim of authorship of it going back to the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. But the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ was the one, the claim in the Quran is being made that he was the one who should learn and memorize the Quran and implement it and call to it and use it to fulfill the revelation's purpose. And that he is a messenger, not the owner of the message, but he is the messenger that brings forward the message. And this becomes clear in multiple instances of the Quran, like in Surah 7, where the Prophet ﷺ basically says that he is just following the revelation of his Lord, and that he is not bringing something from his own mind. And so the conclusion we should come to here is that surely we should take the word of the Prophet ﷺ for it, at least in one point at this stage, and that is that he could not be the one who originated the Quran from. And that is because it is very unusual that someone brings forward something very, very great, like a best piece of work, and then starts attributing it to another source. Like if he would really be the author and originator of the Quran, then he would surely attribute it to himself and not give the credit to another source. Like if he would be that type of person. And it would not make sense that he's saying, I'm just a messenger, I'm just conveying in that context. The author even says that when we look at the topic of plagiarism in history, that there were even people who go and dig up graves to be able to attribute some of the works of that deceased person to themselves. So it always happens the other way around, that someone wants to go and attribute works of others to themselves. It never happens in history that someone comes and they create the best piece of work and then they say it's not from me, it's from another source. This is very strange. But let's still, don't worry, we're not gonna just leave this in the room like that. Let's just examine this even further. What about if someone comes along and says, well, yeah, you may say that, but the Prophet or Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he may have had reasons why he wanted to connect the origin of the Quran to another source. And the reason was that he wanted like a more like a higher authoritative position when he was conveying the Quran by contributing it to Allah, to the creator of the heavens and the earth. And that way it was easier for him to influence people and to make people listen to what he has to say and to follow his orders. So this is when we play devil's advocate, this is maybe what some of the people would say to challenge this claim that Why would he basically attribute the Quran to someone else? But there are two problems with this claim, and we can refute it easily. The first problem is that in authority, like when we look at how Islam was conveyed through the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, is that in authority, the statements of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, and we had this before in the previous chapter, and the statements where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent a worldly, like the statements of the Quran where Allah sent a worldly revelation, are on the same level in terms of authority. So Allah is basically teaching people in the Quran that we should treat statements of the Prophet and obedience to the Prophet ﷺ as obedience to Allah. So actually there was no difference. Like if he would just say the Quran is my work, but it is all inspired from Allah, the words are mine, it's my work, the work of my hands or my mind, but I'm still a prophet of God, and these meanings, they are given to me by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It would make no difference in the practical consequences that this text would have. Because what the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ is teaching is that obeying me is obeying Allah. And that wouldn't change. So why is he still attributing the words of this book to another source? And then we know that there are some types of his word that somehow are connected to revelation as well, but they are not worldly revelation, and he is not connecting those to Allah. So he is only connecting the words of the Quran to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Why is that? So this is the first problem why this claim is problematic. The second problem is that this would imply that the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ would be someone that in his da'wah, in his calling the people, or in his reforming his society, would be someone that would rely on lies and deception and would be like an evil person in his character. And this is this is a claim that could be made, but it is very, very problematic in reality, because historically, if we examine the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, we see that he was the exact opposite of that. And this is why in Surah 10, verse 16, he argues with his people. And one thing that he says is that I lived amongst you for a long time. You know me. You know what a type of person I am. And I am not a charlatan, basically. And we're going to examine this further, because we cannot assume that all the viewers know why the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ could never fall in this type of category of person, and then it will become glass clear that it would never fit in his way of being that kind of person. And of course, we're gonna take the argumentation even further and bring more and more and more reasons why he couldn't be the originator of the Quran. And one of the patterns we recognize when we examine the life of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ after the revelation, when he was receiving the revelation, is that he and his companions, they were confronted with very, very harsh times and harsh situations. And in a lot of those situations, the coming forward of a Qur'anic text would solve the situation completely. But it did not happen, and it got delayed. And the Prophet ﷺ and the companions suffered under this delay to a certain extent. And saying that the Prophet ﷺ intentionally delayed it will not make sense in this context. I know that's maybe what some people are thinking, but this is why we're going to jump into the examples now, and then we're going to see that this is like not possible. And one of those incidents is the incident of the accusation of his wife Aisha radiallahu anha of committing adultery. And this story is well known in the books of the Hadith. It is that the Prophet ﷺ was on a mission with his companions, and he had his wife with him. And when they were returning to Medina from this mission, Aisha was like, she had like her tent, and she was being carried in the tent, but she was outside. She went outside, like she walked away from the people a bit. And because she was so lightweight, and they did not notice that she's not in the tent when the Muslims started returning back to Medina, and they basically left her behind. So what happened is there was one of the companions of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, who always, like he's like the last one on his horse, or he's riding his horse, and he's like the last one who checks the place where the army just had left to see if they have forgotten something, or if there's something like that they basically left behind. And when he went there, he found Aisha, that she was left, and he brought her back to the Prophet and the Muslims in Medina, because she was alone in the desert basically. And the hypocrites in Medina, like the people who were claiming they're Muslims, but they weren't really Muslims, they wanted to attack Islam from the inside, they chose this as the perfect opportunity to attack the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. And they started making claims based on nothing, that the wife of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ committed adultery with this companion that brought her back. So what's interesting here is the reaction of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. Did he claim that he knows what's going on? No, he only said, like, when these accusations were made and people started talking about them, and even some of these companions of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ who were not from the hypocrites, they started talking about it. He always would just say, I only know good from her. I don't know anything bad from her. I don't have anything similar to this, like that she did something in that direction that I could believe these claims. But he as well could not fully defend her. Like, he could not defend her to a stage where he says that these claims are false. He could not do that. But what is really interesting is what he said to her after this. Like, basically when the situation reached its peak, because it had levels, it became worse and worse. And the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ was even considering divorcing his wife. And what he said to her is that he went to her and he said, Aisha, I've heard this and that being said about you. If you are innocent, then God will make your innocence clear. If you have done something wrong, then seek God's forgiveness. Like, this is like a very difficult situation, especially for Aisha radiallahu anha. Like, she has no way to, she's trying to prove her innocence. The Prophet even started doubting her, and the Prophet is basically giving her the choice. He says, if you've really done this, then stop saying that you didn't, and just ask Allah for forgiveness. And that would obviously have consequences on her life, her future life with the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. And then, people are talking about this in the society, and this was a very, very painful situation, obviously, for a woman in her position. And only shortly after this statement of the Prophet ﷺ, where he literally shows that he doesn't know where the truth lies in these accusations, verses from Surah An-Nur, the 24th chapter of the Quran, are sent down on the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, declaring Aisha as innocent, describing that she was innocent and harshly rebuking those who started spreading these rumors and who got engaged in it. And this is very interesting if we entertain the claim that Muhammad ﷺ originated the Quran himself, that he wrote the verses himself. Because then we would claim that he could at any time when these rumors started end these rumors by bringing down those verses, by just writing them down and conveying them to people, or just saying, hey, I got this revelation, my wife is innocent, stop talking about that. He went through a lot of pain. His companions argued between each other, and it is even said that there was almost a war that broke out, like a killing between the Muslims broke out over this problem, because you had this group of, you had the hypocrites, but then you had some of the companions as well who got engaged in this, who were not hypocrites, who got confused through the hypocrites. So you had the Muslims in a weak state. They were weak at that point. They still hadn't had the might in the area, and they were being fought externally. In this situation where the Prophet needed most that they stick together and stay strong, they are almost fighting themselves over this problem. So if he would anyway bring down her innocence later, so much later, why didn't he do it in the beginning of the matter and just end the issue? It makes no sense. And only what makes sense is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in Surah 69, verse 44 onward, where he said, had he dared to attribute falsely some sayings to us, like to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we would indeed have seized him by his right hand and would indeed have cut his life vein, and none of you could have saved him. This is what makes sense. That the Prophet Muhammad knew that he could not say anything from himself. And Allah basically says, I would take his life if he will start talking about me, what I didn't reveal to him. And when we look at this story from this perspective, it makes totally sense. When we look at it from the perspective that he was the writer of the Quran, it makes no sense at all. But is this the only argument? Are we going to stop here? No, there is more. So the next pieces of evidence we have in this investigation are a number of verses that were revealed to the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, that when we read them, we see that they were clearly against what the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ preferred to be revealed to the people. And before I mention these verses, we have to think about the situation. We have to picture the situation, how it was. Like if something becomes part of the Quran, that means Muslims reading this in their prayer. Like Muslims reading these verses in their prayer, in the presence of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. So how can it be that there are verses that the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ never preferred to be in the Quran, and they're still there, subhanAllah, and he's basically forced to convey these verses to the people, and they're reading them, and he cannot do anything about it. How can this be if he is the one who's writing them? Let's look at those verses and see what they are about. The first one of these verses is in Surah 66, verse 1, the first verse. And it says, "Prophet, why do you impose on yourself a prohibition of something that God has made lawful to you only to pleasure your wives?" Look at this claim. Like I'm getting goosebumps when I listen to this claim, and I start imagining like how the Prophet ﷺ felt when this verse came down. And if I give you the context, it will even be more clear. So the context of these verses are that the Prophet ﷺ, he had multiple wives. And there used to happen, naturally, some jealousy between his wives. So the Prophet ﷺ used to go to one of his wives, Zainab, and he used to drink a certain drink there. And then some of the other wives, they agreed that whenever the Prophet ﷺ comes from Zainab to them, that they say that he has a bad odor in his mouth. He has a bad smell in his mouth. And they would say, "Have you drank that specific drink again?" Like it was something that she, like Zainab was, radiallahu anha, was used to make for the Prophet ﷺ. And it wasn't bad at all, but they wanted to, like I said, it was something, it's natural that this happens, and it's not a problem as well. But what the Prophet ﷺ did then, when his other wives, like they did this to him, he said, "I will never drink this again. I will never drink this again." So he made drinking this drink haram for himself, basically. And in this instance, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent down these verses. And through sending those verses, through these verses being revealed, a matter had been made public that may have never come, like that we today never maybe would know about if it was not in the Quran. That generations of people are memorizing this matter about the Prophet ﷺ. And imagine that he is teaching these verses to his companions. He is like, it is like I lack the words of describe the situation. Just imagine the Prophet ﷺ teaching these verses that are unpreferable to him, to his companions, so they read them in prayer. So they're praying and they're reading these verses, and the Prophet ﷺ is walking amongst them or praying with them. He reciting himself these verses. He praying to the people and saying, reading these verses, "Oh, you Prophet, why do you prohibit for yourself what Allah has made lawful for you?" What was the wording? "Only to please your wives." Only to please your wives. So, subhanAllah, this is definitely a strong evidence against the claim that the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ could be the originator of the Quran. But there are more verses that we're going to go into now. And the next verse and piece of evidence we have here is in Surah 33, verse 37. It states, "You would hide within yourself something that God was sure to bring to light, fearing what people may think, whereas it is God alone whom you should fear." Again, very strong verses. And how could the Prophet ﷺ prefer that this stays in the Quran? That he goes out to the people and reads to them, that fearing that he would hide something with him that God would bring to light, and that he would fear what people may think, whereas he should fear God. Like verses in this context. It doesn't make sense that he from his own choice, if he was the originator of the Quran, that he would come up with these verses and go to the people and give it to them and tell them to recite these verses in their prayers and in their lives. Another verse is in Surah 9, verse 43, that states, "May God pardon you. Why have you granted them permission to stay home before you came to realize who was speaking the truth and before you come to know the liars?" This was about some hypocrites. They asked the Prophet to, when the Prophet wanted to go on a mission, they asked to stay back, and the Prophet gave them permission. So the Prophet is giving them permission. If we say that he was writing the Quran, so why would he give them permission and then go later and like basically rebuke himself and saying, why did you give them permission? Doesn't make sense. And subhanAllah, this doesn't need much more explanation. At every verse we're going through, it becomes clearer and clearer that this person could not have originated the Quran. The next verse is in Surah 9 as well, verse 113, that states, "It does not behove the Prophet and the believers to pray for the forgiveness of those who associate partners with God, even though they happen to be their near kin, after it has been made clear to them that they are destined for hell." And this verse was sent down after the uncle of the Prophet, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, Abu Talib, passed away. And Abu Talib was someone who protected the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam in times of the beginning of the message, where he was conveying the message to the people. And he held a lot of harm away from the Prophet ﷺ, but he never became Muslim, and he died as a non-Muslim. So the Prophet ﷺ tried to ask Allah forgiveness for him, and Allah teaches him here in the Quran. He reveals to him these verses that this is not suitable for a prophet and for the believers to seek forgiveness for people that are people of the hellfire because they did not accept the message. The Prophet called Abu Talib to the message, and he refused to enter it because he wanted to keep his loyalty to his forefathers upright more than he wanted to follow the true message of God. So here again, the Prophet ﷺ does something. If he wanted to, or if he's writing the Quran and he wants to make this concept that the Muslim cannot ask forgiveness for someone who died as a non-Muslim, why is he then going and asking for forgiveness only to rebuke himself later? It makes no sense again. And the next verse that we're going to mention here is in Surah 80, verse 5 to 10, that states, "But to the one who considered himself self-sufficient, you were all attention, yet the fault would not be yours if he remained uncleansed. As to him who comes to you with zeal and with a feeling of fear in his heart, him you ignore and busy yourself with trifles." This is a very interesting situation. This was a situation where the Prophet ﷺ is conveying the message of Islam, and there were two groups of people, or one person and a group of people, that wanted his attention at the same time. There was this blind man who wanted guidance from the Prophet ﷺ, but then there were this like high noblemen of the Quraysh that were not Muslim. So the Prophet ﷺ refused to talk to the blind man, and he sent them away because he was like, if I convince this nobleman of Islam, it's going to be better for the religion and it's going to fulfill the cause better. So he sent back the blind man, and he went and gave his attention to the nobleman of the Quraysh. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala rebukes him in this verse. And these were all like not sins of the Prophet ﷺ. The Prophet ﷺ, he was a human at the end of the matter. He tried his best to do what is right. And the difference between him and the other humans is that Allah always corrected him. And this is what we mentioned in the first chapter as well. It was not possible that he does something that was not in line with what Allah intended for him to happen, and without Allah correcting him. And this is what we clearly see in these verses. So if he would write the Quran himself, why would it even come to that? That there is a verse that starts with a rebuke of his action towards this blind man and going to the nobleman of the Quraysh. Subhanallah, it is he wouldn't do that in the first place. Subhanallah, and this shows further that he was truthful in his claim that he is just forwarding a message. But let's stop here and let the information sink in, and let's start our next lesson with some more verses that prove this point even further. Until then, Assalamu alaikum.